793 AD. Without warning, ships appear off England's east coast. They land at Lindisfarne, Holy Island, one of the most sacred Christian sites in Britain. Monks are killed, treasures and relics are taken. Then the attackers vanish back across the sea. This is Western Europe's first traumatic encounter with the Vikings. For the next 3 centuries, these pagan raiders from Scandinavia will terrorize Europe. They raid, they extort, they enslave, and eventually they conquer. They travel far beyond Britain, deep into Russia, into the Mediterranean, even attacking Constantinople itself, which they call Miklagard, the Great City. Viking longships give them reach and speed. Seamanship and navigation allow them to strike without warning. But here is the problem with that explanation. The Vikings are not fighting helpless societies. Their enemies, the Anglo-Saxons, the Franks, are themselves warrior cultures. They understand violence. They understand war. So the question remains, was there something more? Something beyond ships and swords? Something that gave the Vikings their lethal edge? To understand this, we turn not to battle records, but to stories. The Viking sagas. These texts were written in Old Norse. Some are sagas of Icelanders. Others are sagas of kings. Others still are legendary tales of an earlier age. They were written centuries after the events they describe, often far away. Because of this, they are dismissed as unreliable, part history, part fiction, and that criticism is valid. But it misses the point. Even when the sagas invent events, they preserve attitudes. They reflect how Vikings remembered themselves, what they admired, what they mocked, and how they believed a man should face death. Across all these sagas, one attitude appears again and again, a fascination with death. Not quiet death, not fearful death, but death as a moment to speak, to joke, to sing, to make a final impression. Alongside this runs another striking feature, a specific sense of humor. Cruel, grim, sometimes deliberately vulgar. Together these form what can be called the Viking mindset. And it reveals itself most clearly in how Vikings are said to die. One of the most famous Viking deaths belongs to Ragnar Lodbrok. According to his saga, Ragnar sails to England seeking further fame and wealth. His expedition fails. He is shipwrecked off the coast of Northumbria. He is captured by the Christian king Ella. Ella chooses a spectacular punishment. Ragnar is thrown into a pit of venomous snakes. As he faces death, Ragnar does not beg. He does not plead for mercy. He delivers a final line. The piglets would grunt if they knew how the old boar died. On the surface, it sounds childish, almost absurd. But in Old Norse, the phrase is a joke, deliberately crude, full of barnyard imagery. And the joke is not for Ragnar himself. It is for King Ella. What Ragnar is really saying is simple. My sons will hear of this, and when they do, they will avenge me. This is not a hope of rescue. Ragnar knows he will die. It is a promise of violence after death. Interestingly, this line was known outside Viking tradition. A Latin chronicler records the phrase, but misunderstands it. He thinks Ragnar hoped his sons would save him. He was wrong. Ragnar was not asking to be saved. He was announcing what would follow. And historically, something did. In 1865, a great army landed in England. Led by men identified as Ragnar's sons, the Ragnar sons, they devastated Northumbria and killed King Ella. Whether Ragnar truly died in a snake pit is doubtful. The story was likely created later, but the invasion was real. And the saga did what Viking stories often did best. It turned death into motivation, and humor into menace. The story of Ragnar's death is almost certainly not true. There is no contemporary evidence that he died in a snake pit. The version we know appears in much later saga tradition. But that does not make the story meaningless. Quite the opposite. The timing matters. England was invaded in the mid-19th century by leaders identified as the Ragnarsons, the sons of Ragnar. These men did not present themselves as ordinary raiders. They framed their invasion as vengeance. The saga provides the motive. It explains why England was attacked. It explains why King Ella had to die. In this sense, the saga is not a record of events. It is a justification for them, a narrative created after the fact to give moral logic to violence. This is a recurring pattern in Viking tradition. Death is not only remembered, it is reshaped. And once reshaped, it becomes fuel. The Viking mindset was not limited to kings and heroes. It also applied to the weak. According to legend, Hrolf Kraki was a great Danish king of the early 6th century. His hall stood near Leger, where he gathered famous champions. When his cousin Hjorvard attacked at dawn, Hrolf and his warriors made a final stand. All were killed. All except one, Vagr. He was the weakest man in Hrolf's court, the butt of jokes. The last person anyone expected to matter. Yet he had sworn an oath to avenge Hrolf if the king were killed. After the battle, Vagr was dragged from a pile of bodies and brought before Hjorvard. Hrolf was dead. His champions were dead. The Scylding dynasty was finished. Hjorvard made a fatal mistake. He demanded Vagr's allegiance and handed him a sword to swear upon. Vagr took the sword and ran Hjorvard through. He was killed immediately afterward. But that no longer mattered. The vow had been fulfilled. This story carries a clear message. In Viking culture, a promise did not depend on strength, only on willingness to die keeping it. For a long time, stories like this were treated as pure legend. Enter archaeology. Near the modern village of Leger in Denmark, excavations revealed something unexpected. The remains of enormous halls built one after another across centuries. Not one hall, not two, at least 6. Leger was not imaginary. It had been a real center of power throughout the Viking and pre-Viking periods. This does not prove every detail of the saga is true, but it does something more important. It confirms the world described in the stories actually existed. The mindset, the values, the obsession with honor and memory were not inventions. They were cultural constants, and they shaped how Vikings behaved when death was unavoidable. The Viking mindset appears most starkly when defeat is absolute. The Jomsvikings were a legendary band of elite mercenaries, bound by a strict code. They were forbidden to show fear under any circumstances. In 1986, they were defeated at the Battle of Hjörungavåg by Jarl Hakon and his son, Jarl Erik. After the battle, the surviving Jomsvikings were captured. They were lined up for execution. One by one, they were beheaded. Some insisted on standing rather than kneeling, demanding to face the blow directly, so no one could say they flinched. Then one man stepped forward and knelt. He asked a favor. He was worried about his hair. He did not want it stained with blood. He asked another man to hold it aside while the executioner struck. As the axe fell, he jerked his head back. The blade severed not his neck, but the man's hands. The spectators burst into laughter. Jarl Erik laughed hardest of all. He declared the joke so good, the man should be spared. The Jomsviking refused. He would not accept mercy alone, unless all the others were spared as well. According to the saga, they were. The story sounds absurd, implausible, almost certainly fictional, until archaeology intervenes. Excavations uncovered a mass grave. Dozens of beheaded skeletons, all male, all Scandinavian. Several had been beheaded from the front, exactly as described. The details may be exaggerated, but the attitude is consistent. Death was not a tragedy to endure quietly. It was a stage. By the early 11th century, Viking culture was changing. Olaf Haraldsson, king of Norway, had converted to Christianity, yet his mindset remained unmistakably Viking. In 10,2009, Olaf was driven into exile. The following year, he returned to reclaim his throne, fully aware that the odds were against him. On the morning of battle, Olaf did not give a speech. He asked his poet, Thormod, to sing. Thormod chose a poem tied to an earlier last stand, the Bjarkamal, linked to the death of King Hrolf. It was not a song of victory. It was a song about men meeting certain death. The implication was clear. There would be no retreat. Olaf was killed fighting in the front rank, struck down by repeated blows. His bodyguard died around him. Thormod survived the battle. He did not celebrate. He lamented not dying with his king. At that moment, an arrow struck him. The saga implies Olaf, now dead, had sent it. Thormod began composing a poem about his wound. He died reciting it, failing to finish the last line. A bystander finished it for him. The bystander was Harald Hardrada. Harald Hardrada became one of the most formidable figures of the Viking world. He traveled east to Kiev. He served in Constantinople as commander of the Varangian Guard. He accumulated wealth, experience, and reputation. In 1066, As King of Norway, he invaded England. At Stamford Bridge, his army was caught off guard by King Harald Godwinson's rapid march north. It was a hot day. The Norwegians had left their armor on their ships. They faced an armored English army without protection. Harald advanced anyway. According to the sagas, he composed poetry as battle began. He criticized his verse for being too simple, then produced a more complex version. Finally satisfied. Unarmored, wielding his sword with both hands, Harald fought. He was killed by an English arrow to the throat. Most of his army died with him. He is often called the last Viking. The saga claims 400 ships came, 24 returned. Whether the poetry is authentic is doubtful. Almost no one survived to remember it. But again, that misses the point. The poems express acceptance. No outrage. No denial. Only recognition that this time they would lose, and that they would fight anyway. The Battle of Stamford Bridge ended the Viking invasion of England, but it did not end its consequences. The battle was a catastrophe for the Norwegians. Harald Hardrada was dead. Most of his army lay with him on the field. It was also a catastrophe for the English. King Harald Godwinson marched north at extraordinary speed. He won, but at great cost. His army suffered heavy losses. 3 weeks later, the English faced another invader. At Hastings, they were no longer at full strength. On October 14th, 1066, Harald Godwinson was killed, and England fell to William the Conqueror. The irony is precise. William himself was descended from Vikings. The Viking Age ended not with disappearance, but with absorption. For nearly 3 centuries, Scandinavians terrified Europe. They raided, settled, ruled, and reshaped regions. Their political power eventually faded, but their mindset did not. What defined the Vikings was not ferocity in battle. It was their attitude toward death. They did not deny it. They did not negotiate with it. They did not let it strip them of agency. Instead, they used it. They joked at the moment meant to break them. They composed poetry when defeat was certain. They turned execution into performance. They transformed dying into final control. This is why fear did not work against them. You could kill a Viking, but frightening him was another matter. The danger did not end when the battle was over. You were not safe until the last one was gone.